welcome once again to Android Design in Action. I'm Roman Nurk.
Hey guys, my name is Adam Kosh.
And hi, I'm Nick Butcher.
And today's episode is all about common UX issues, or anti-patterns as we'll call them. Let's just jump into the slides here since we have a lot to cover. Just a bit of background. Our team, the developer relations team for Android, we do lots and lots of different reviews for apps. We will look at apps in both a formal and informal setting. Formally, internally we have a review process that we look at apps for. This is completely separate from, editorial, featuring anything like that. We just look at apps and we provide feedback to, some of our app developers that we work with. And then in an informal setting, obviously, we're always, looking at apps, getting, APK links sent over to us on Google+, and we're, looking at them and providing our feedback. And so, over the past, few years of doing this, I guess, we've noticed a couple of trends, a couple of recurring issues that seem to affect a lot of apps, not every app for certain, but lots of apps. And so we wanted to put together an episode of Android Design in Action where we highlight the top 10 items that we keep seeing over and over again. So before we jump in, anything else you guys want to say about our review?
So that's what you meant by formal and informal setting. I thought you meant like sometimes we review apps in the bar, sometimes.
We should review apps in the bar, actually. Good idea.
Yes, at a gala maybe. Okay, all right, so let's jump in. So these are our top 10 Android UX anti-patterns. Before we jump in, a lot of this stuff is not necessarily negative. It's really constructive criticism. The idea is that you guys kind of take some of this feedback and see how you can improve your apps. And so with much love, these are our top 10 anti-patterns that we've noticed. So let's jump in. The first is, and we have funny little titles at the top, so enjoy. The first is, thou must load this or else. Basically, modal loading dialogues. And these are basically, it's pretty obvious, right? It's dialogues that appear that say loading or saving or sending or whatever, and sometimes you can't even press back to cancel. If you have poor network connectivity, there's just no way out except for pressing home. And it's one of the easiest ways to kind of tick off your users, especially those that, like I said, aren't in a good connectivity setting, or those that, simply are very quick. They're trying to do a bunch of things at once. The other thing I'll quickly point out is one of my pet peeves is when you throw up a loading dialog when switching tabs, because basically you switch to a tab, maybe you accidentally chose that tab, and now you have to wait for that tab to load to switch to something else. So the solution to this is really to try to use inline loading spinners instead, like in this little graphic here, or better yet, just try to load data in the background where possible, so that you can generally just avoid showing loading spinners. So that's kind of my I guess the number 10 in the list. Anything else before we move on, guys?
One thing that just really annoys me, though, is when I touch on a list of items and I go to the details, and then it throws up that loading spinner. Then I hit back, and I can't go back to the list of items again. It's just so frustrating. So,
I think generally dialogues,
make sure you respect the back button.
A fairly poor UX. Like generally anything that's blocking, anything that says you have to deal with this first, unless it's completely avoidable, like unavoidable, then try and avoid dialogues, but especially loading dialogues. Get my vote.
Absolutely. Okay,
all right,
moving on.
Let's go to number 9 in the wise words of MC Hammer.
Can't touch this.
All right, that's our attempted translation. We've brought this up many times in ADIA, and this is definitely a recurring theme we see when we're looking at apps. So the first one is small touch targets. So really, all touch targets should be 48 dips. We did write here that it could go down to 32 dips if you absolutely need to, but really 48 dips is what you should be aiming for. Why? Because that sort of maps to roughly 9 millimeters, or I think somewhere between 7 and 9 with a little bit of variability, which really ends up being the perfect touch size for the average person's fingers. So unless, I guess, you're targeting a particular user group with extremely small hands, maybe babies, you should really be shooting for 48 dips here. And then the second one, and this is something we see frequently all the time, is no touch feedback. And if you put an app in front of any of us, you'll probably see one of the first things we do is we actually go and touch something, and then we slide our finger off a little bit just to see if there's any touch feedback there. So it's a pretty common mistake to make, especially when you're not using the standard button components, because you may have to do a little bit of extra work to sort of add that touch feedback. But it really means that your app feels much more responsive.
And I think it's also the no-touch feedback as well as the previous anti-pattern. It really changes your app's feeling of perceived latency. When things don't respond or you can't do certain things, there's an increased sense of perceived latency, or users perceive that your app is slower than it actually is. So it's one of the fastest. People talk about speed all the time. Let's make our app faster, faster, faster. It's not just about raw speed. It's really about perceived speed.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, you can go. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think it's really important when we move towards like digital interfaces where the Holo style is all about white space and typography and so on. It's really important to communicate what is tappable, what is you can interact with, and I think touch feedback is something that instantly reacts to you and lights up the entire area which you can interact with, will kind of communicate back to you, and so you'll know next time, this is the area I have to play with. It's really important.
Exactly.
Cool. All right. Should we move on?
Yep. So number 8, visual design. I think this was the one I'll talk about. So in general, design does not mean playing with Photoshop until you use all of the effects, like until you use all of the layer effects, like here on the left, like the drop shadows and all of that. There are a couple of concepts here going on. Basically, when thinking about visual design for your app, focus really on content rather than Chrome. So users really aren't installing your app just to see the pretty buttons and the pretty top bars and all these fancy things. They're really installing your app probably because they care about the content or the functionality that you offer. So really make that shine. If you're going to dedicate any sort of visual attention or visual resources to anything, it should really be the content. Additionally, a couple of other things in the realm of visual styling for your app. Try to be consistent. All too often we see apps that have 3 or 4 different button styles or checkbox styles or something, and they're kind of mixing and matching. And generally that can be a result of too many cooks in the kitchen, too many people working on the same app. So where possible, try to introduce consistency using things like Android's styles and themes framework to basically make it really simple to have consistent styling across your app. And the last thing in the realm of visual design is poor attention to detail. So it's not only about getting the high-level things right, like getting the right color and getting the right I guess basic theme down. It's really about attention to details with respect to typography, making sure you're using the right typographic palette. Also with respect to metrics, that's one of the biggest things that people do wrong that we see is people don't use, or developers don't use the right spacing. So there's too little space or there's too much space around an element or too small margins around the sides. And things like that can really break the concept of alignment and visual balance within your app. So definitely focus on these things. And I think certainly we've covered most of these in Android Design in Action in episodes past. But definitely this is one of the things you should focus on. Anything else before we move on? Okay, let's do it.
So in at number 7, we've got living in the past, or as we said, if your app is living in 2009, your users are going to have a bad time.
It rhymes.
Yeah, I'm just visioning the South Park ski instructor there. Sorry, right. So the first point I want to make about this is, the menu button of shame or the legacy menu button. There's kind of very little excuse. Like all of these points we've got on the slide right here generally point towards the fact that you're not kind of updating your application to move with the latest. I mean, it's one thing to look at the platform distribution stats and say, hey, this, some of my users are on older devices. But that's kind of not really being fair to the users who are on newer devices or have these kind of shiny new devices, probably people who are downloading and installing your application more often. So we really think you need to be kind of looking at, maybe not the blazing latest release, but here we said you should be targeting at least API 16, which is the first Jelly Bean release, which came out at Google I/O last year, so over a year old. If you're not kind of targeting that newer version, you're probably like missing out on some new functionality, as well as probably degrading some of the functionality because some of the shims that this system has to put in place, like the compatibility menu button. So if you're below 14, I think you've got a real big problem because you're going to get this legacy menu emulated button of shame. It can look terrible, especially on devices like the HTC One, where it puts up this big bar across the bottom of your application and really ruins all the kind of time and attention hopefully you spent on the rest of your design. So really think about that. And the other thing is not kind of picking up on the modern look and feel. Like, so for example, if I'm using an application and it has some kind of gingerbread era styling, for example, it might look kind of hollow, but then you touch something and you get that kind of orange highlight, or you scroll, you get that legacy kind of rounded scroll bar. Maybe you're familiar with that. That kind of really just breaks the experience for me. Suddenly it's just like, oh, that was unexpected. What's going on there? So wherever possible, you want to be using the latest and greatest styles and building on top of them, using them as your foundation. So doing things, I think one I often see this is with spinners as well. So you'll be using an application and they've set a style on a progress spinner, an indeterminate progress spinner, often set the style to indeterminate, and they haven't used the appropriate kind of theme default syntax for it. So you get kind of a gingerbread style spinner and it just looks completely gross and out of place and breaks the magic.
The other problem with the loading spinner is that the gingerbread era one used frame animations, so there are basically like 8 frames, like tick, 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 and so on. And the hollow spinner is actually using a tween animation, so it's a much smoother rotation. You actually see each individual frame as it gets rendered. Well, not each individual frame, but each point around the circle. So it's much, much better to use the hollow style indeterminate loading spinners.
Yeah, so I guess the takeaway from this, what we're trying to say here, is use the latest and greatest and kind of like build on top of it.
Excellent. Moving on. Okay, polluted Android. Who's going to talk
I think this is me again. So there's a page on the design guide called Pure Android, and it is what it sounds like. It's talking about don't borrow metaphors from other platforms, don't use kind of iconography or other such from other platforms. If you're building an Android experience for your Android users, then build an Android experience. I think we did a whole show about branding and consistency, whether you should be consistent with, and what that means, what you should be consistent with if you're on other platforms, for example. So I'll refer you back to that for the kind of deep dive on this topic. But essentially, if your app doesn't conform to the Android platform, you're the one who's going to look out of place. If I'm using 50, 60, 70 apps on my Android phone and I switch to your app and your app doesn't look and feel how an Android app should look and feel, then you're the one who's going to stand out. So some very, very common things we might see might be, for example, using right pointing carrots to indicate that there's, a level below of information. That just doesn't make sense on Android. I mean, we have a very different kind of default transition animation. So, pointing right and then something expanding and kind of fading, just doesn't line up, as well as going back. It doesn't slide back the other way. So I guess there's just no spatial metaphor there, especially with Android's use of the horizontal metaphor for moving between content. So like tabs, for example, you might page between them like this, but then if there's a right arrow, does that mean I'm going down or I'm going side to the other tab? It just doesn't work. So respect that. Tabs, there's Android tabs go at the top. So if you're doing tabs at the bottom, basically you're going to look out of place, and it's going to be, why is this app doing this differently? And the last one we pulled out is just like wholesale borrowing from other platforms. This is if you see, say, iconography from another platform, or a picker from another platform, which just looks completely out of place. Just don't do it. Just use the default. It's what your users expect, and doing otherwise is being kind of quite arrogant and aggressive towards them. So stick with what the platform gives you.
Yep. I think that covers it well.
Yeah.
Let's move on. All right. I think, was this me? This may have been me. I think this was me. So actually this plays into what Nick was mentioning about branding. Where do you which metaphors do you use? Which UI patterns do you use? This is the anti-pattern of the navigation is my brand, or everything. The entire app should be mine, right? I should control everything. And generally that's the case. You should control visual styling. You should control the information architecture. And we did a whole segment on this. But there are a few things that you should really try to use from the Android design guidelines. Obviously, pure Android, that's very important, but also anything related to core app navigation. So things like the action bar, things like tabs, and also things like the navigation jar. So this anti-pattern is basically like, apps that reinvent the wheel by creating a custom top bar with like a centered title and then like 2 actions, one on the left, one on the right, or maybe kind of like a very different looking navigation jar indicator. This basically isn't Android, right? I mean, Android users expect an action bar at the top. The title should be left aligned. There are certain things that should exist in the action bar: navigation in the top left, actions in the top right. Or very poorly implemented action bars, and generally this is because of the lack of, the lack of a toolkit that allowed you to bring the action bar to earlier versions of the platform. But Action Bar Sherlock has existed for quite a while, and that's still a great choice. But also Action Bar Compat was recently released. So for designers and developers, for developers especially, if you're rolling your own action bar, just stop doing it and just use Action Bar Compat. But also navigation jars. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but there are a lot of specifics in what should and what shouldn't go into navigation jar. Generally, anything that's not really core app navigation, something that the user is going to be switching between somewhat often, that probably shouldn't go into navigation jar. And we did another full episode on this, so I won't go into the details. But if you're a developer, you should definitely be using drawer layout and action bar jar toggle. Try to avoid using any of the other libraries out there that don't implement this way, because you're not going to get the same interactions that the platform provides. And in this vein, I just want to quickly point out some things that shouldn't go in the navigation jar. So Home, Explorer, Shop Now, My Profile, that's fine. I mean, that's kind of core top-level navigation. Things like Search, it's navigational, but by platform convention, it should really go into the action bar. So it does not belong here. Settings also in the action overflow. Help, About, Send Feedback, that should all go into the action overflow. Anything linking to other apps that your brand offers, that should probably not go here, because chances are folks don't care about every app in your portfolio. So generally you want to put that, if you do want to place it in your app, put that somewhere deeper in the app, maybe about your brand, and in there list the other things. And then obviously random things that people will never click, like my sister's friend's website that I promise is really awesome, please check it out. That does not belong in the navigation jar. So try to keep it simple, try to keep it to what's in the guidelines. Let's move on.
All right. So number 4 is custom non-Android sharing. Now I will note here that the screenshots in this slide are actually the positive or the good sharing mechanisms, not the examples of bad or non-Android sharing. I was looking for good examples of that, but there's a lot of them and we see it a lot, but I didn't want to sort of ding any particular app out there, so put in some positive examples. Positive reinforcement is the name of the game here. So, Android has a great ability to share or use this action send intent between applications. So you should always use it. Always make it available to your users. Again, along the same things that we were talking about before, it's just a frustrating experience when the user goes to try and share something and they're stuck with 1 or 2 static options. As you can see here, on my phone, I have tons of different apps installed. I share to different apps all the time, and so not having the ability to choose the one that you want to share to is just a really frustrating user experience. Just to quickly go over the sort of examples here, on the left, you've got the Share Action Provider, and so that's something that goes directly in the action bar and actually has a pop-up menu that drops down there, and you can choose from your most recently or most frequently shared applications. And then the second one is the standard system share dialog that you can trigger using that action send intent. And then on the right, this is a custom example actually from the Timely app, which I really like. So in this case, they actually have kind of listed just a few to start with. But you can see that they have this little drop down at the bottom saying more, which actually goes and programmatically fetches the rest of the sharing options available. So I guess the moral of the story is try and always use the system share intents. If you really must, for some reason, have a list of specific networks, maybe it's part of your business goals or something else, you should still complement it with the standard action send based sharing alongside.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, one more thing. This actually is in the pure Android guidelines, right? So again, kind of don't try to don't violate any of the pure Android guidelines. Try to adhere to those as best as possible. And this is, I think, it's called "Don't hard code links to apps in your app."
Yeah, and actually, sorry, one last thing. From a development standpoint, it's actually much easier to use the system share intents than going off and do it all yourself. So, I mean, from a development standpoint, it's also a positive thing.
Absolutely. All right, moving on. Mimicking native with WebView.
I think this is me again. You can see here some quick examples on the left. We've got the ADIA YouTube playlist loading in a WebView. It's a great experience there to browse the ADIA videos. This is really just a bit of fun because actually, if you load the YouTube website, it looks fairly decent because it switches to the mobile version. But on the right there, you can see the great example of the ADIA, or the Android Designer in Action, or ADIA application that's in the Google Play Store, which looks fantastic. It's very, very responsive, works on all different screen sizes. It really works great. So let's move to some of the talking points. So first point, it's not genuine. It's kind of like lying to your users. So it's not really the most positive experience, especially if you're sort of taking up a lot of the core UI with a web view. And following from that, the performance is generally going to be degraded. If you have a drawer that's built using a web view, you're going to notice that it's not as smooth, it's not as responsive, it just doesn't behave like the user would expect. And then from the example on the previous page, don't package up a web app in an APK just to be on Android, just for the sake of being in the Google Play Store to be on Android. We love web apps. Web apps work great on Android, but where the user expects them is in the browser, in the Chrome browser or the system browser, where they sort of understand that the UI conventions and they're viewing a web page.
And we're not saying don't use web views at all, right? I mean, there's certain components where it makes sense, like Gmail, for example, renders HTML.
Correct.
Email, and it makes perfect sense to use, say, a web view control there, or if you're rendering some like news content, then perhaps that makes sense. Yeah, I'm saying don't build your whole application with this.
Exactly, yeah. So another good example is Pocket, which uses a web view or HTML to render the article views, and it actually works really well in those particular cases. We're really saying don't just like throw a web view into the entire application and make it take over the sort of standard core UI elements.
Yeah, one last point I wanted to make about web apps versus native apps is there's a tendency for brands to be like, oh, we need to be on Android, right? And you mentioned this, right? But we need to be on Android, so we need to make a native app. But a ton of Android usage, regular users, most of them use the browser quite a bit. So that you're not losing those users. You're just they're gonna access your experience through a different mechanism. And if you think that a web-based solution is the best option, then that's going to work for a lot of users. So don't immediately jump into, oh, we need to just have this kind of hybrid thing where we just throw our entire web app into a native APK. So that just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think you'll find if you do go and throw a web view and make it take over the entire application, you're going to sort of violate a lot of these other things that we've talked about today, like the touch feedback, the touch size, the UI elements, the living in the past, all these things, very hard to do if you're going to use a web view to take over your entire application. Should we move on?
Yep, moving on. Nick, you want to talk about onboarding?
So in it 2, we have poor onboarding UX. So this is one of my personal bugbears, like when you fire up an application and like 101 different things are competing for your attention at the same time, and none of them are what I launched your app for, which is probably to see the content. This is a personal, frustration of mine. So there's many things that people tend to throw in at the first run. So things like requiring registration straight away, a splash screen, popping up their own kind of login provider, and so on and so forth. And all of these things are just road bumps, really speed bumps, stopping me from doing what I launched the app to do, which is see some content. So I would much rather see an application that gets me to content as quickly as it can, and then delays any necessary kind of steps until they are, truly like the last minute. So log on, for example, let me, see some content and try and interact with it. And if I try to do an interaction which requires log on, then prompt for it, because at that point I can understand exactly why you're asking for this thing and so on. Splash screens are another personal bugbear. It's in our design guidelines forever that you shouldn't really use splash screens. They don't really serve much purpose other than delaying you from getting to content you want to see. So if you think that it's the only way to embed branding into your application, then I think you have bigger problems. There really are much better ways to kind of provide branding to your application, like using the action bar and your palette and so forth. So I don't accept that as an argument at all. And then conversely, there's lots of things you can use to actually ease the onboarding process. So, for example, integrating with popular logon providers. So things like Facebook, Twitter, Google Plus have excellent kind of single-click sign-on providers. You can even do intelligent things like use the package manager, like a system component on Android, to detect if the user has like one of these native applications installed, which is a pretty strong indicator that they a user of one of these logon providing services, and use that to show or hide or reorder your logon options, and they'll provide a much slicker UX. If you really must like force someone to log in with like a username or password, for example, then there's some clever stuff you can do. Like my phone already knows a bunch of my email addresses or usernames which is saved on the system. You can query for these and use them to autocomplete or pre-populate fields. You can query the system for the user's full name or telephone number and so on and so forth. So you can pre-fill a bunch of different addresses. And I've even seen some applications going a step further. If you really have to do a sign up on the phone, do you really want to have to sit there and kind of like peck out like a password? Why not like offer to auto generate some random string and let them kind of hit refresh to rotate it to something different? Because the user can always just reset it later as long as they have their email address in there.
And they're probably not going to remember their password anyway. I mean, it's just like, I just want to put in some password to get past the screen. So.
Exactly. So basically do everything you can to kind of like simplify the first use experience and get you to content as soon as possible. I think too often when we're like, designing and developing apps, you've looked at the application so many times, right, that you kind of speed through that process, or, you logged in the first time and after that you then continue to look at the subsequent screens and you forget about, the first impression that you're making on your users. So it's super important. I mean, this becomes even more important if you're lucky enough to become featured or such like, or picked up by a blog or something like that. You'll be surprised at how many users will install your application without fully understanding the value proposition, exactly understanding what it does, just to try it out. And if the first thing you see is a bunch of overlays explaining how to do stuff and logins and pop-ups that are forcing you to take more steps before you get to the actual content to show them the actual value, then you'll have a huge kind of fall off.
On the converse side, like completely on the opposite end of the spectrum, if I open up your app and I see, an immediate like empty list view with nothing there, just like a little plus button in the top right and just really just an empty screen, that is also poor communication of the value proposition. So empty states, which we'll talk about very briefly, empty states for collections are actually a really valuable way of communicating that. All right, moving on. I think we're running low on time. The last one, number one, should have done a drum roll, but I guess we didn't have the time. Android is not just phones in portrait. What this means is, if you're developing an app and you have a phone UI, don't lock it into portrait. Make sure that the user can rotate into landscape. Quite a few. I think something got chopped off here. There's supposed to be a graphic here, but whatever. Quite a few users actually. Use phones in portrait, in landscape rather, especially those with maybe car docs or even desktop docs. So for example, if you're a sports app, there should be kind of like a landscape dashboard view or something, especially if I'm in a car in some sort of dock. If you're another type of app, if you're like a news app or something, consider think about how you can kind of rearrange your text so that it works, and potentially even switch around your interactions. Maybe horizontal goes to vertical, swipe or something like that. Not really sure, but I mean the point here is don't force your users to hold their device in a certain way. And then another component of this is that Android is not only phones. Android involves tablets as well, and the line between tablet and phone is kind of blurry. But really, Android is really just well, I guess one of the ways you can describe most Android devices right now is touch screens ranging from about 3 inches to about 10 inches. So responsive design is really important here. Make sure that your app can respond to the size of the screen, and that it makes best use of white space and best use of content in all those different configurations. And not only that, I mean Android is also it's not only about touch. There are some devices that are D-pad focused, like Google TV. So definitely think about ways in which you can respond to your device in both portrait, landscape, tablet, phone, and different input types.
I think it's really important, the point you've kind of called out here in the subtext, that it sounds scary as well, right? Saying being responsive to all these different form factors and so forth. But there really is so much you can do very, very easily. Things like, upping the font size when you have over a certain amount of space, or, changing the padding, or going to like a centered with margins. Things like that can be like an hour of work or 2 hours of work, and make your application vastly better on a larger device. So it really is worth just trying it out on a range of devices or emulators and seeing how it looks.
Yeah. All right. With that, let's jump into some quick honorable mentions, since we're running super low on time. First, per the guidelines for launcher icons, your app icon should really be a distinct silhouette. I know there are a couple of Google apps that don't really adhere to this guideline, but that's definitely something that we're looking into. Don't forget, like I mentioned, don't forget the empty states for your collections. So, if you have nothing in a list, if you have, let's say, a to-do list, right, and if you have nothing in there, if you have no to-do items, offer the user some ways to add something to do, like maybe like a plus button, or introduce what is going to happen once you add the plus button, or once you press the plus button.
Or even have some sample content in there, like a to-do list might have some sample to-do items.
Yeah, some sample to-do items like milk, cheese, eggs, and so on. Graphic assets should be crisp. I think most folks are starting to do this correctly, but definitely make sure to provide XHDPI, and now with Samsung Galaxy S4, HTC One, XX HDPI assets. Those are becoming the norm. Take advantage of platform features. Make sure that if you're especially if you're in a category that is heavy on widgets like sports or news, make sure to provide a widget, and then make sure to provide expandable notifications. It's too easy. It's so easy. Say what?
I have to go and get kicked
Oh,
out.
okay. All right. See you, Nick. Make sure to provide expandable notifications. They're just so easy to add. Lastly, notifications, you should use them correctly. Don't show too many notifications. Show them in an appropriate fashion. Show them in an appropriate time. And then for the icons themselves, the notification icons in the status bar, make sure to use white icons. Don't add any color, because the status bar actually automatically dims that. So it's going to look like it's going to go from like a blue or a red to like some sort of maroon or some sort of dark blue. It's just weird. So those are the honorable mentions. Very last but not least, if you have any anti-patterns that we missed out on today and you want to let us know about them and share or maybe rant about them, just kind of comment about it in either the event or the Google Plus page, we'll see what we come up with. All right, so I think that was it for today. Nick just dropped off, so I guess we'll just end it here. As always, I'm your host from Nurk.
See you later, guys. My name's Adam Kosh, and over in London we had Nick Butcher.
And I'm not Nick Butcher. That Nick Butcher. Okay. All right. See you guys next time.